Do you love Elden Ring? Is the world beautiful, the bosses challenging and fun? Are the weapons and builds endless and addicting? But most importantly, are you burnt out? Today I have created some remedies in hope of curing this terrible condition and get you right back into enjoying this fine game. These remedies and cures will be in the form of builds and playstyles to freshen up your experiences and hopefully get you as close to that feeling of playing this game for the first time. So my sick viewers, without delaying this any longer, let's hop into it. Alright, so the general theme of these builds will be to limit yourself to one niche weapon or category, and this will force you to use some of the more unique weapons that not only have completely different playstyles, but are also quite enjoyable. These builds have a range of difficulty attached to them, and some are clearly better than others, but I was not afraid to include the builds focusing on some of the not so great weapons, as if you're burnt out of this game, I assume that you are decent enough that you can power through. I found that these 4 builds have the most unique playstyles attached to them while also being fun and making the game feel different enough from previous attempts. First up, we have a very generic build, but it is incredibly underrated. Elden Ring is a game full of super cool and often broken weapons with addicting and very attractive weapon skills that often just play the game for you. This build forces the player to just be a knight. No Ash of War to rely on, just a basic sword and shield if you want it. It lets you take a step back and appreciate every aspect of an enemy's moveset. You don't have a ranged option to spam or a broken L2 to hide behind, making you learn the parts of an enemy's moveset you may have never seen before, so don't hate it until you try it. Just because this build is basic does not mean it is bad. You will get plenty of stance breaks and the damage is always solid. You can really pick any armor set and weapon, but I chose to use the Banished Knight set as I not only love the look, but the sword has a unique R1 string that made it fun to mess around with. The Banished Knight armor set also provides you with a ton of defense. Lastly, feel free to add a shield if you want the full knight aesthetic and playstyle. This can be a great option if you're struggling, as abusing guard counters makes this build flat out broken. For talismans, I use the 2-headed turtle talisman for increased stamina regen, the Dragon Crest Great Shield talisman for increased defense, and then either the 2-handed sword talisman or the Great Shield talisman, depending on if I'm using the shield or just 2-handing my sword. Another notable option to consider would be the Great Jar Arsenal talisman, as unless you have high endurance, you will certainly need it to be able to carry all of this gear. My Wondrous Physic contained the Deflecting Hard tier and the Stone Barbed Crack tier to break stances easier, but the Opaline Hard tier is also a good option for reduced damage. Lastly, for stats, I won't go too in depth as it's pretty simple, but here they are if you want to see what I did. I would recommend Heavy Affinity if your level is on the lower side, but as you climb the New Game Plus runs, quality will eventually outdamage the Heavy Affinity. So, if you've been using constant overstimulating builds or abusing fun spells, then I would strongly recommend giving this playstyle a shot, as it may seem boring, but it really does make every other aspect of this game stand out, and is definitely a way to spice up how you approach each encounter. Next up, we got the build that is certainly the most badass in the Shadow Realm, and that, my friend, is the martial arts. You know that sense of superiority that you get when you see the victory message appear after a boss fight? Well, that message never feels better than when you were just throwing straight hands at these DLC bosses. This playstyle is similar to the basic knight one, but is a little more niche. This build has very specific strengths and weaknesses, and it's up to you to decide how to utilize or combat each. There are 2 different martial arts weapons, being the Dryleaf Arts and Dane's Footwork. Both operate very similar and are best paired with one of the 2 exclusive skills, Dryleaf Whirlwind and Palm Blast. Dryleaf Whirlwind is a very satisfying flurry of kicks that stunlock smaller enemies and can create some very cool combos. On the other hand, Palm Blast is an AoE that is able to be charged, allowing you to deal stance damage and blast away enemies. Either Ash of War is a good option, but provide very different utilities. What I like to do was use both of these martial arts and have one skill equipped to each of them. This way you can switch between the 2 and cover more options on the fly this way. Of course, each of these builds in the video can be min-maxed and can benefit from using incantations such as Golden Vow and other support spells. But I found that whenever I get bored, it helps to just strip a certain playstyle down to its basics and force myself to use those specific mechanics, creating a new challenge for this game. This build specifically was very fun to learn the different combos you can do and relearn a lot of the openings during boss fights, as your range is quite limited. For my armor, I just wanted to maximize style, so I went with the Dane's armor set to complete the whole vibe. Stats are dependent on what affinity you wish to go for, but I would recommend either heavy, as it gets an A scaling in strength, quality, as it gets a B scaling in both dexterity and strength, or cold, as it will build up frostbite. Personally, I went with a quality build as it has the highest damage cap at those New Game Plus runs. My exact stats have been on screen for any who are wondering. Talismans are also pretty simple. I use the Shard of Alexander for increased skill damage, the Rotten Wing Sword Insignia for increased damage with successive attacks, the Crimson Seed +1 Talisman for increased healing, and lastly the Dragon Crest Great Shield Talisman, as these DLC bosses can hurt. Other notable mentions include the Shattered Stone Talisman, as it will increase the damage of your kicking skills, such as Dry Leaf Whirlwind, and the Two-Headed Turtle Talisman for increased stamina. For my Wondrous Physic, I use the Thorny Crack tier for increased damage and the Opaline Hard tier for increased defenses. This build was by far my favorite playthrough of the DLC and came closest to that first playthrough magic, as I approached each fight differently and every part of the martial arts moveset is so satisfying to hit. I would 100% recommend giving this one a shot if you haven't. This next build makes use of one of the weapon categories I was most excited for in this DLC, and that would be the Smithscript weapons. These are the category of throwable weapons that you can find throughout the Ruined Forges. Sadly, their usefulness varies, and overall as a class of weapons they struggle. However, with the help of some patches and your perseverance, you can still create quite a fun and perfectly reasonable challenge. These weapons are often weaker than their regular counterparts, but have heavy attacks that throw the weapon. For this build in particular, I use some of the more fun options to really force that change in playstyle. I went with a dexterity focused build, so the weapons that I used were the Smithscript spear and throwing knives. Additionally, I used the Smithscript shield in my offhand when using the spear. So, what's the game plan with these weapons? Well, the throwing knives are unique in the sense that every attack they have is a throwing attack, and thanks to a buff that they got, they're actually usable now. Of course, damage is minimal, but you have the advantage of range, and so it leads to a very satisfying dance with the opponent where you get little chip damage in between attacks and are very mobile. I also choose not to use the shield with this part of the build because you need to two-hand these knives, as it doubles the amount of knives that you throw with each attack. Personally, I found that Bloodhound's Step was the icing on the cake for this part of the build, as it offered an additional very fluid way to dodge. If you are fine with the regular dodge and are looking for something else, Scatter Shot and Piercing Throw are good options. Okay, so the throwing knives were just half of the build, as by themselves they are fun, but have clear weaknesses and can have their infuriating moments. The other half of this build utilizes the Smithscript spear and shield. Luckily, these weapons weigh very little, so you can have them all equipped no problem with a medium roll and switch between them on the fly. So the game plan with these is much more similar to your typical build. The spear acts as a good way to do reliable close range pierce damage, and also because it's a Smithscript weapon, it can be thrown at distances. The shield is another cool option, as it is a shield, and so you can always block and guard counter, but that's definitely not its strength, as it got pretty lackluster defenses and guard boost. Instead, its strengths lie in its skill, Discus Hurl. This is where it gets its Smithscript name, as you can basically throw a spinning, homing Captain America shield. It is different than the typical thrown weapon, as you first throw it and it spins in the air with an active hitbox, and then it flies straight towards its target. It is a very nice option to throw out during a boss fight due to how quick it is. Also, it can hit multiple times if thrown up close, so stun locking smaller enemies is also a valid approach. I found myself switching to this build against the more aggressive bosses, as the knives proved to be increasingly difficult against some of the DLC's roster. Again, there are other Smithscript weapons. These are just the ones I chose for this build, as I found that they each gave a fun sub-build that can be switched between quickly. I found myself using the Champion's armor set for aesthetic purposes, but feel free to wear any armor that you find cool, and if you're really struggling with the damage output of this build, the Rakshasa armor set is a good pick, as it's not too heavy and gives a nice damage buff. For talismans, I used the Smithing Talisman for increased damage and throwing attacks, as well as the Spear Talisman, because between the knife throws and spear pokes, I found myself hitting the opponent during their attacks a lot, so the damage buff is always appreciated. Next, for defenses, I use the Dragon Crest Great Shield Talisman for more physical defense, and the Crimson Seed +1 Talisman for better flask regeneration. Another good option would be the Two-Headed Turtle Talisman for faster stamina regeneration. Here are the stats for any wondering, focusing mostly on dexterity, as these weapons are keen and fused. I will note to make sure you have at least 11 faith and intelligence, as those are requirements for some reason. Lastly, for the Wondrous Physic, I use the Opaline Hard tier for increased defenses and the Thorny Crack tier, as the daggers can build up the multiplier very fast. This is a build that can be frustrating, but by switching between the two weapons on the fly and slowly adjusting to its playstyle, I have to say it is certainly worth it. This build really offers so many different ways to play and provided a challenge that was not just artificial difficulty, but felt good to overcome. This is definitely a high contender for one of the most rewarding builds to learn. Now for the last build. Again, I am focusing mostly on specific weapons that feature their own unique playstyles and mechanics, so this time the weapon of focus is the Euporia. This weapon's unique quality is that it gains luster the more you hit an enemy, and that will not only make it look super cool, but this energy can also be expelled through its skill, Euporia Vortex. Think of this skill like a holy version of Comet Azure, only this time you actually have to work for it a little. Because this weapon is a twin blade, it racks up the hits necessary to give it its luster quite quick. There are a total of 2 different stages to its luster. When the first stage is reached, the blade will start to glow, adding a damage buff and adding the beam to its skill. The second stage causes the blade to glow even further, resulting in a bigger damage buff and making the beam addition to the skill last longer and deal more damage. The general strategy with this weapon is to fight with it as a normal twin blade while building luster for most of the fight. Then when you have a medium to large opening, during a boss's phase change for example, you let the skill rip and watch that health bar run away. Additionally, this is a faith-centered build, so if you want, feel free to add on any incantations such as Golden Vow or Knight's Lightning Spear, but personally I found the weapon to be more than enough for most situations. For talismans, there are many good options, but I went with the Two-Handed Sword Talisman as it's just free damage, the Rotten Wing Sword Insignia due to how many hits the weapon can get in, the Shard of Alexander to make the skill even more potent, and then lastly the Crimson Seed +1 Talisman, as it is my personal favorite defensive talisman in the game. Other options are Millicent's Prosthesis, the Two-Headed Turtle Talisman, the Sacred Scorpion Charm, and the Dragoncrest Great Shield Talisman. Armor is again purely aesthetic, as I am a big fan of looking good while rolling around. I use Letta's armor set for this build as I like the general holy theme it carries. If you are min-maxing, then Rakshas's armor is always a good choice. In terms of the Wondrous Physic, I use the Holy Shrouded Crack tier for more damage, as well as the Thorny Crack tier because again, this weapon hits a lot. For the stats, it is very faith focused like I said, and they are up on the screen if anyone wants to know my exact stats. That about wraps up the video for today. Please leave comments if you have any other builds that fit this unique but fun category, as I would love to try them out myself. If you guys like these builds and want to see more videos covering this topic, let me know. With that, thank you all for the support. As always, like and subscribe if you enjoyed, and until next time.